The opening sequence to episode 49 is a super dense one, mixing together elements of just basic recap, very intense foreshadowing, and entirely new setup for Return to Shiganshina. As per usual, with this being another big historical turning point, we open with Armin's narration as he recaps the whole hardening breakthrough and how preparations for the mission to recapture Moria are now in full swing. But note how the music doesn't quite frame this as some huge triumph as we saw in Trost. This time, it is much more of a kiss-curse type of situation. And speaking of, that is when the syringe is introduced and Armin's narration is abruptly cut short. He is the, as much as humanly possible, unbiased narrator of the story. But with this syringe, things get awfully personal for him. So yes, Eren's hardening is a massive leap toward recapturing Moria, but considering the toll that it has already taken on him and the toll this syringe would still take on the scouts, it's not entirely W's all around. And what's also not W's all around is Hanji noting that, with their current technology, there is no way to analyze the fluid in the syringe, then noting that whoever made it must have had far superior technology. In hindsight, we of course know for a fact that Marley does indeed have far more advanced technology. But even now, we've already seen the canned herring, as well as Grisha's mildly magical healthcare abilities that already hint toward far more advanced technology. Though on top of that purely practical concern, thematically, it also deliberately undermines the great triumph that is Eren's hardening. Not only have we seen Annie do what is basically the same thing, we also have Rhino's plates are equally durable, and now we discover that this enemy seemingly has better technology just across the board. Each and every one of these big breakthroughs just seems like we are playing catch-up. More on this in a bit. Though Pixis then says that, well, if they can't figure it out, they might as well put it to use. Erwin agrees, but says that he can't be trusted with it, saying that his soldier days are over as he reaches for his missing arm. Missing limbs and really any kind of disabilities are things that I always find a little amusing in fiction for the simple reason of them often being with very little intent, if that makes sense. A lot of series, and especially anime, sort of use wounds, scars, and other things like that to avoid telling a backstory and just use them as a symbol of strength and perseverance. If you see a dude with like a massive scar across his face, implicitly it tells you that he has probably seen some stuff. I think that works perfectly fine for a shonen series, but when you're operating in a more grounded setting, I always find it very amusing how, like for example, someone loses an eye, but they immediately adjust to the completely messed up depth perception, because they're a Giga Chad, I guess. It makes sense for Levi because he's an Ackerman, but for others, not so much. This is a Korotos video, so Walking Dead mention, but I remember Kirkman talking about exactly this when someone lost an arm, and suddenly, if they were sitting with an open can of food, someone had to open that can for them. If they had to climb, things got very tricky, and so on. So in a series like AOT, where the scouts move with these dual hooks activated by dual swords, yeah, losing an arm is a very big deal. And also, thematically, you can think of it as his wings of freedom sort of being clipped, if you will. It's obviously nothing groundbreaking or super important, but considering the setting, I think it just needs attention to detail that it is actually followed up and this wound isn't like just a wound. But Erwin then turns to Levi saying that they don't know when or if the situation might arise, but that Levi will have to decide when and on whom to use the syringe. First off, obviously, this is putting the gun on the wall, if you will. I mean, it's literally, hey Levi, you might have to use the syringe. Big surprise, he's gonna use the syringe. But number two, I think it's here where Levi is really established as one of the main characters of this particular episode. Much of this is of course colored by hindsight, but knowing that Levi ultimately chooses Armin, it is just really hard not to notice that just about every Erwin scene is framed not from his point of view, but from Levi's. And speaking of, while Levi is asking for an order, Erwin refuses to give it and still just asks him whether he'd do it. I think here we have a really interesting moral quandary of killing versus saving. Considering this entire season has been about reframing the conflict as always having been human, slicing someone down in the name of quote-unquote good, or maybe not even good but just slicing them down, is something all of our main players have already been through. But having to explicitly choose which one of your allies will survive is a whole nother story. Especially because Levi already has mountains and mountains of survivor's guilt. If you are in a bad headspace, that decision isn't who will you save, but rather who will you kill. And continuing on that thread, Levi then just asks, what will Erwin do once he reaches his dream? Again, if you go through this episode with the assumption that you are watching it from Levi's point of view, I think it becomes pretty easy to see why he ultimately chooses Armin. Here he'd ask what Erwin will do next. Later he'd ask whether he'd sacrifice the rest of humanity for his dream, but later, and this is very much flipping the board, he hears Armin cheering about humanity pursuing something greater and reaching the sea. On top of Kenny's death still looming over Levi in this episode, there is also the inevitable decision of who he will save. And I think the episode frames that beautifully as we see Levi agree and simply stand back. Zachary goes on a ramble about his artwork and whatnot, but we linger on Levi. He's just lost Kenny and already fears losing another. Hold that thought for now. As for the title of the episode, Night of the Battle to Retake the Wall, not really much to say here aside from the whole Night of trilogy we see in the series. This episode very clearly mirrors Night of the Closing Ceremony. We see the stairs in Trost, we see the whole Jean-Eren thing, etc, etc. But eventually, this little trilogy would be completed in the far less triumphant Night of the End. The squad would once again be sharing a meal together and getting ready for a big mission, but Eren would not be there. The staircase they sat upon and looked out at the world beyond the walls would not be there. Trost itself and the comforts of actual housing would not be there. Their squad mates, the food, none of that would be there. The saviors of humanity would be alone in a cold dark forest preparing to fight traitors. Which, by the way, is also sort of foreshadowing because like Reiner and Bertolt are also sort of traitors. But in the final season, who is traitors referring to? Is it referring to our squad or is it referring to the Jaegerists? Well, in any case, traitors. Moving into the episode itself, we open with another debrief among Erwin's squad, this time about Grisha and his appearance from somewhere beyond the walls. Much like Eren saying that he hadn't had much time to think about all pure titans being just innocent people, I think this is one of those scenes that deliberately sits us around a table and really forces you to take in everything we've been learning. We now have Annie, Reiner, Bertolt, the Big Monkey, Ymir, and Grisha, all of whom have come from beyond the walls and all of whom are titan shifters. But among them, Ymir was a super weird, neutral sort of party, and there was also some sort of cult, while only Grisha has used his skills to actively help people, but everyone else just wants to kill us. Of course, in hindsight, this whole helping the people of the walls warrants the obligatory "it's all about perspective." As Hanji notes, he pursued the royal family with some mysterious goal, but he also seeded this entire mystery of the basement in the first place. Grisha is now this absolutely perplexing figure with seemingly dozens of clashing intentions. He smooshed the royals and forced his own son to eat him. But he is also the one pushing the scouts to learn of the outside world, which very clearly has much more advanced technology. But at the same time, if he came from that outside world, why didn't he ever say anything about that advanced technology? And funny story here, when the series was first airing and we hadn't seen any of Marley yet and all the King Fritz lore was still super vague, I remember that around this time I had cooked up another theory about Paradis, basically just being a sort of a zoo hypothesis type of deal. In case you've never heard of it before, the zoo hypothesis is one of the theoretical answers to the Fermi paradox, or in other words, the question of where are all the aliens? Like the name of zoo hypothesis implies, it proposes that some incredibly advanced alien species might refrain from contacting Earth because 1. We are much less developed to the point that talking to us would be like talking to a zoo animal, and or 2. It would allow them to observe natural evolution with no external interference. There are other spins on this where instead of a zoo, it's like a laboratory where external interference is also done with the purpose of studying reactions. But point is, me and a few of my buddies talked a whole bunch about there potentially being something like that going on with Paradis. We never talked about the simulation hypothesis though, because that would be an isekai, and I don't think Attack on Titan is an isekai. I don't remember exactly what I'd cooked up, but I remember thinking that there could be like a weird Titan plague thing, and Grisha, being a doctor, comes to Paradis hoping to cure it and whatnot, but obviously, it mostly was complete nonsense. That said though, the whole technological asymmetry angle was one that I always found super intriguing. But okay, my nostalgic tangents aside, again note how whenever the basement is mentioned, we linger on Levi, the one who now actually bears the weight of Erwin's dream. And because this is overanalyzing, I also can't help but notice that 1. Erwin is not in his uniform and is wearing exclusively light tones, and 2. When he says that they've theorized all they can theorize and that now it's time for action, we too suddenly stand behind him, but there's this ethereal glow enveloping just him. Clearly, he's not the only one out of his uniform, and we've seen him dressed in similar clothes before. But that dying light behind him just hits very, very different knowing that this is his final mission. But what I think is the absolute best part is what we see when their little squad stands up to leave. They all agree that they're going to keep this little celebration dinner thing secret, which we of course know remains a secret for all of 15 seconds. Obviously, nothing about it was actually meant to be secret. I mean, Erwin didn't even talk about anything related to the Season 1 plans, even with his number ones. When Erwin wants to keep something secret, he literally just doesn't say it. But as everyone leaves, just giggling about having meat and whatnot, we focus on Erwin, whose face is just exhausted. Despite being this close to fulfilling his dream, he doesn't at all seem hopeful or happy. And again, there's that evening sun behind him. The sun seems to be setting for him. And so, Levi pushes the doors closed, and we see that one-on-one confrontation that we didn't quite see in the opening sequence. He first asks what the plan is after retaking Moria, saying defense is obviously next, but what after that? I think with this, there are two very distinct ways of looking at it. The first one is what we actually see. Erwin says that there are still enemies beyond the wall and that they have to defeat them. To which Levi responds by saying that he's asking because there's a good chance he won't be around by then. So purely practically speaking, this is Levi asking for future orders in case their commander is, well, not capable of giving commands because, he's dead. And of course, there's also the underlying implication that he knows he'll survive because that is his curse. Everyone else, be it friends, other elite scouts, family he didn't even know he had, everyone dies, but never him. So him posing this question as, you'll be dead before me, so tell me what happens next, also has a ton of emotional baggage. But I also think there's a deeper second layer to this, and that is that Levi might be fearing that Erwin would simply become another Kenny. That is to say, if Erwin were to achieve his dream of reaching the basement and confirming his father's beliefs, he might just be completely done, in the same way that Kenny just gave up after learning that he could never be the Founding Titan. We'd of course see this plenty more with Eren, but with these aspirations and dreams, there is always that somewhat terrifying question of, but what next? I think in the real world, each and every one of us have had that feeling to at least some extent. Even with something as simple as a TV show. You finish it and you have this hollow feeling because that is it. There is no next episode or next thing. That's it, it's over. So expand that dumb little example to a literal lifelong goal. Imagine spending literally your entire life dedicated to a single goal and actually reaching it. I mean, in a weird way, it must be horrifying, right? You kind of don't want to reach it. And to really zero in on that, Levi says that Hanji should lead the mission and that they just tell everyone they argued and Erwin eventually agreed. But after remembering his dad, Erwin just says, no, I don't care if I end up dead, I'll even act as bait. I think it's this exact moment that Levi would eventually play back in his mind when deciding who to give the injection. With his goal being this close, Erwin is becoming very, very reckless. His big gambles leading up to this point were, well, gambles. But now that super big picture and almost detached perspective he had in setting up these plans is quickly disappearing. And the only thing that matters is that basement. And I think very visually, we are also shown that there is now distance between them. Levi does not step forward. He pushed the door closed and simply stands there, as if he too was about to walk out. And the music here, oh boy!
Stay safe at your desk and keep using that head of yours. That's the last thing the Titans would want.
But it doesn't stop there, because Levi still tries bargaining with him, saying his mind is the greatest weapon humanity could ever have. But Erwin fires back saying that no, they should gamble everything on this single plan. Only for Levi to cut him off, saying that he will break his legs if he keeps making excuses. I think throughout this entire sequence, entire episode, and really arc as a whole, Levi is slowly but surely realizing that Erwin is running on fumes. And if we tie that in with the rest of the season's themes, there's also that they're special people but I wasn't one of them angle, and Kenny's everyone is a slave to something angle. We talked plenty about this with the whole coup d'etat plan, but I think it's these scenes right here that really knock Erwin down a peg and show us that, at the end of the day, there are special things about him, but he is like the rest, a slave to the past and a slave to the supposed secrets hiding in the basement. Earlier in the series, much like with Eren and his pursuit of freedom, that seemed like this far-off ideal for which he'd make sacrifices. But now that his goal is actually tangible, Well, Levi asks whether learning of the truth is more important than his legs, to which Erwin, without skipping a beat, says yes. And Levi then asks, more important than humanity's victory? To which Erwin again bluntly says yes. I think we don't see Levi's eyes because he knows that Erwin doesn't have a lot left in him. All of those trolley problems we talked about earlier in the series are suddenly reframed so as to ask, was that greater good really the greater good? Or did it just happen to work out that way and Erwin was simply pursuing selfish desires? Is Erwin just another Kenny dreaming of finding this thing that will magically solve all of his problems only to learn that, well, life doesn't exactly just stop after that. But on the flip side, remember that for Levi, as much as this does color his decision in Shiganshina, Erwin's ironclad confidence is exactly the thing that convinces him for this mission. Bluntly stating that getting to the basement is more important than the victory of humanity is just about the most no-regret statement you could ever make, right? Like we've seen before, Levi is not someone who questions anyone's judgments or beliefs or anything else, so long as they are consistent and dedicated to them. So, as of now, yes, Levi would follow Erwin. But when it comes to choosing which one he'd actually save, well, we'll get to it later in the episode. But before we get to the party time, we get a mid-card about meat. Yes, it's literally just about meat and how Luffy would most certainly starve within the walls. My ha-ha funny goofies aside. Much like we already heard back in Trust and the potential fall of Rose, he's just reminding us that recapturing Moria is more than just a symbolic gesture that humanity is thriving. There is also a very practical matter of land for livestock and farming and so on. In the spirit of overanalyzing, I have seen a few people bring up the question of, if Paradis is so ridiculously huge, why do we even need that much land for barely 1 million people? And while I don't think we have quite enough information to really evaluate the necessity of that land, I think it's worth bringing up that technological aspect again. In universe, there are things like that special yeast, so obviously our world versus the Attack on Titan world isn't exactly apples to apples. But one of the most important technological developments of the 20th century is fertilizer. I think most people don't really think about it much because farming still kinda just seems like farming, but comparing modern crop yields versus even like the late 1800s is just a night and day difference just because of fertilizers. So with these extremely harsh winters, rudimentary farming techniques, and a lot of the Walls' population not even being involved with farming, the only way to make up for all of that is just a lot of territory with crops. Back in medieval fantasy minus the fantasy days, I'm pretty sure like most people engaged in farming. And by most, I really mean like most minus the very, very rich royalty. I don't know nearly enough about like actual crop yields with seasonal adjustments and whatnot to actually be running numbers, and I think that would be overanalyzing, even for overanalyzing. But the point I'm making here is that I think it's perfectly reasonable that even with so much territory, they could be forced to ration food, especially meat. Returning to the episode, one small detail that I really like here right off the bat is that all of this is mirroring episode 4. Only this time, much like our main cast, Trost is a little beaten up. Though when it comes to the celebration, everything immediately descends into absolute chaos, and we straight up get JoJo fights between Connie, Jean, and Shasha. Jean and Shasha? Yeah, that sounded very weird, I'm leaving it in. This is definitely overanalyzing, but I think even this creates some very neat parallels to episode 3 and 4, where the overall tone was much lighter and the super serious moments were comparatively rare, whereas now, it's the complete inverse. This entire season has been non-stop suffering. So this feast just being all-out carnage is a nice little reminder of those early days with the whole Potato Girl incident and everything we got into there. And we also see that angle of economic inequality again, with Mob just casually asking whether they really never get meat. He was in the MP, aka the much richer interior, so yeah, meat probably isn't that big of a deal. For Sasha though... Though because this is still Attack on Titan, we also get some lore with a side of depression. Connie briefly remembers how Sasha offered to share some of the meat she yoinked, saying, "It's wild how things have changed." For Eren, on the other hand, this is more than just a little goofy memory, because his memories of that entire day are very murky, not just because of the Crystal Catacombs, but also because that was the first time that he properly transformed. I think that sudden twist in the music captures Eren's state of mind here really well.
牛も羊も買えますから。巨人が入ってくる。おい、
Obviously, Connie and the others were also all friends and also all squad mates with the Marley squad. But I think, generally speaking, Eren was much closer with Reiner and Burrito, and now they also have this entirely new bond that are their titans. So, while Connie mostly just remembers the goofiness Sasha got into, Eren suddenly remembers Bertolt's "I felt sorry for you." And I think that's further built up by Eren asking whether it's really been just 4 months. The obvious implication, just like Keith said, is just that they've seen so much in just these 4 months. But in the wider lore of Attack on Titan, I think this is another moment of Eren's warped perception of time and the events he's really lived through. And also in a super meta sense, the shot of Bertolt's Eren remembers isn't just reused animation. This is a new scene, and quite literally a new perspective on the events we've already seen. But to bring us back to a little bit of goofiness, Connie just jokes that they're super cool for climbing the ranks that quickly. To which Eren responds by saying that that's just because you're a genius, clearly poking at the whole Connie and Sasha are dumb gag. Wait a minute, Eren just pat Connie on the head. Oh no, Connie, no, not again, Connie, please, no! We then see Jean roast baby Eren, also known as Mob, also known as Mushroom, also known as Marlowe, about how he has 0 experience and should stay in the rearguard. They have a whole back and forth about sacrificing themselves and whatnot, which of course doesn't age too well. But above all, I think it just depicts how Jean's perspective on the world and really their mission has changed since those early days. He's still super blunt and somewhat cynical, but instead of just making fun of Mob and egging him on to be reckless as Eren once was, he quite seriously just explains that this is no fairy tale, that what they do is dangerous, and that no one's going to benefit from him just up and dying. Considering all the death we already saw in Trost, I think this is just some very neat setup for the preceding arc and all the casualties we'd see there. But because we are still mirroring episode 4, Jean does of course end up picking a fight with Eren himself, just for good measure. And the fact that we go from Armin just awkwardly sitting in the middle of them to them already at each other's throats within like a single frame is just perfect. And this might just be my read on the situation, but I also find it a little funny how Jean actually seems a little bit scared, because, well, Eren is a Titan, and he already floored Jean once, right? But yes, considering all the depressing stuff we've seen thus far, I think it's just a nice moment of levity. Stuff like Connie just standing there with a spoon still in his mouth and them wondering why isn't anyone stopping them, while Armin and Mikasa both sit there with the most meme-worthy small smileys just gets me every time. And more broadly, I think it also neatly demonstrates how Eren and Jean's friendship and camaraderie has really developed. Back in Trost, that was mostly just a straight-up fight and disagreements. Now though, they are very good buddies, and all of these are just inside jokes, and they're basically just putting on a show for everyone. They are literally like those two friends you have who spend hours dissing each other on Discord, but once everyone else leaves, they just sit there, chilling, for hours. Everyone knows they're very good friends, but when they get heated, you are almost like, wait, hold up, maybe we're going a little bit overboard, but then everyone leaves and they're just chilling there together. Problem for all Horseface and Mr. Future Man is that they get a little more than they wished for.
Oi.
And so, we finally get to the stair scene, where right away, we literally mirror the scene with Mikasa and Armin now switching sides. This little Night of trilogy began with Eren being super feisty, all of them joining the scouts and looking out at this impossible world that lies ahead. Now on the other hand, Eren realizes that much of what he did was just because of jealousy. His whole joining the scouts and becoming some hero of humanity was just because he wanted to be as strong as Mikasa or Levi. But now he has realized that he was wrong. None of them can change a thing by themselves. All of them are necessary pieces of a much bigger puzzle. First off, there is some bitter irony in this Night of being concluded with Eren actually being completely alone. Even their past enemies would all be playing their necessary parts in bringing him down. This little Night of trilogy is concluded with just Mikasa and Armin sitting around a campfire far from their homes. And the best part, and also a somewhat cruel twist, is that the episode Dawn of Humanity actually presents a far dreamier vision of such a night. Not in Trost, but far beyond the sea in the land of their quote-unquote enemies. And there's also that vision of Eren and Mikasa just running away, something that of course never was. This is really one of those sequences that just hits super hard in retrospect. In the same way that Eren's capture, all the way back in Season 2, started this irreversible spiral where their last connection to their childhoods was severed, this too presents a trilogy that never was. A trilogy of Eren, Mikasa, and Armin. And speaking of severing their childhoods, they briefly catch a glimpse of someone who looks exactly like Hannes, which is frankly uncalled for. But Isayama continues cooking because they then talk about how, after retaking Moria and defeating their enemies, things would all go back to normal, which too I think has multiple layers. If for Erwin, there is now this prospect of the basement being this catch-all solution after which his story can end, then for Mikasa and their little trio, there is always just one more thing before we can go back to normal. First it was joining the Scouts so that they could always be together, but time and time again, they were torn apart. Then it's fighting threats from within, but the more we fight back, the more of them keep popping up. And now, it's recapturing Moria, which we of course now know just leads to yet another enemy and really all the enemies. And on top of that, I think it also depicts Mikasa's weakness that eventually allows Eren to manipulate her, not just because she loves him, but also because, in large part, she really lives in those memories. She really is like the ultimate nostalgia enjoyer. If you recall episode 7, she got up because if she were to die, the memory of Eren would disappear. I think a lot of what she does in the present day is with the belief that one day they will just be Eren, Mikasa, and Armin just racing through the tree on that hill. I think for her, there is always that hope of one day it will all go back to as it was. But while Mikasa depicts that longing for the past, Armin shoots up and presents a longing for a better future. He tells them of the ocean, of the fiery waters, of the lands of ice, and of snowy deserts. Eren, of course, represents both the past and the future, but as of now, it's that dream of the ocean that just unites them. A dream that will push humanity further than it has ever been, and maybe, just maybe, finally allow them to return to normal. Unfortunately, Eren did pat Connie on the head. But perhaps the most important part for Return to Shiganshina is Levi sitting just around the corner. I know I've said it multiple times already, but I think it's after this night that his mind is like 99.9% made up. Erwin told him that he would sacrifice humanity's victory for the basement, and that his story, by and large, ends there. Armin, on the other hand, he dreams of the sea, something they've never seen. We'll talk about this plenty more when we get there, but while Erwin's mind is indeed one of humanity's greatest weapons, an even greater weapon is sometimes just hope. Something we already saw with Eren's Titan back in Season 1, and something we would see right now. Because we then smash cut from Levi to the gates opening in what is a very ominous sequence that, again, in hindsight, is hard not to see as deciding Erwin's fate. But yes, everyone salutes and cheers as they set off, something that is an absolute first for the Scouts. Despite Trost, despite the death they've seen, despite the False King being ousted and traitors in their midst, there is hope within the walls, and there is also a dream of the sea. And this also brings me back to what I mentioned last time with Flock, and the narrative within the walls just flipping entirely. The Scouts are no longer just wasting resources or feeding themselves to Titans. No, in the eyes of the walls, they are now the truly chosen liberators of humanity. Something that, as we'd see very soon, can quickly become twisted in the mind of someone like Flock. But of course, Jean, Sasha, and Connie can't resist, so they also scream, which is definitely funny goofy, but what's not funny goofy is Erwin shouting.
The operation to retake Wall Moria begins now! Scouts, move out!
This is just straight goosebumps, and I love it. The animation, the voice acting, the mission starting, it's perfect. Everything, down to the last minute detail. But because this is overanalyzing, let us talk about Erwin's horse, and we will talk about it again. Yes, I am well aware that it is the same exact horse he has used every single time in the series, let me overanalyze. The rest of the horses, which are super spooky CGI by the way, are all brown, right? But Erwin's horse is white, or pale, as in the pale horse, as in the personification of death, as in Erwin dies. In Norse mythology, Odin also has his 8-legged white grayish horse Sleipnir, I think that's how you pronounce it, but there aren't really any big lore connections that really make sense. But okay, that aside, I think there are a few instances in history where commanders specifically use differently colored horses in battle so that they could be easily spotted. But I'm pretty sure it was like super rare because, well, a commander shouldn't really advertise themselves as the commander. Because, you know, the enemy can see the advertisement and they'll take out your commander, it's not a good thing. But the episode is not over just yet, because the music then abruptly cuts short and we drift on over to Reiner and Bertolt just casually sitting atop the wall. Pretty blatantly just saying, well, we're waiting. But the episode is not over just yet either, because this episode also has the infamous creepy glitching ED. For those of you who were following the series as it came out, and like me, were lucky enough not to have been spoiled, I think I'm not alone in saying that this thing right here is 1, the coolest thing ever, and 2, literally stun-locked me for like 5 minutes. It's this kind of almost fourth wall-breaky storytelling that absolutely cemented Attack on Titan as one of my favorite stories of all time. Because, come on, this is so cool! Practically speaking, of course, it is just a pseudo-trailer for the second half of the season because there was a pretty long wait in between. But come on, it's so cool! As for what it actually shows, well, it shows like everything. It of course begins with a bloodied Levi calling, presumably, Eren and Mikasa idiots. I remember this spurred like a bunch of theories about how Levi might have become a Titan shifter because the blood is actually evaporating off of him. I remember one of my friends said that Armin's probably dead and that's why Eren and Mikasa are mad because Levi used the syringe on himself. Of course, that is not what happened because this is after the Zeke fight, so that's just his blood. And by his, I mean like Zeke's blood because like Levi's blood wouldn't evaporate. As for what else? Well, we see the fried chicken tender Armin, we see Dina Fritz / Jaeger, and we actually go from her right to her Titan form. We then see the shoe that Eren would find by the basement. We then see Titans that Levi would cut down to get to Zeke. We then see the basement lock. We then see Keith's squad. We see the injections and the basement key. We see pure Titans. We see the blood activation thingy we saw with Mikasa in episode 7. We see Zeke. We see the death of Hannes. We see Grisha taking Eren to transform him. Also the sort of Hilo statue from Eren's dream. Armin's seashell, even Rosemary and Cena eating a mirror because that's relevant again. And of course, Eren and Mikasa both crying, then Levi punching Eren, and then Mikasa pouncing on Levi. So this was like a smoothie of red herrings, but also not red herrings because everything it showed you is actually important. So you know, like, pure Titans are created by the syringe and Eren was turned into a Titan, but there's also the Beast Titan, which we haven't seen in a long time, by the way. Odd that you reminded me of that. And what's happening here? Wait, maybe the fried chicken tender is Armin. Take me back, I want to go back to those theorizing days, that was so much fun. There are way too many individual frames to mention, but you get the idea. It's not quite as insane as the Season 2 ED, but just for an episode teaser, it gives you an awful lot of new information as well. In a super meta sense, considering the glitch happens right at the Requiem part and the drop of blood hitting the flowers, I think you could already very confidently say that someone is dead. I remember having a personal little theory that literally everyone except them was dead. That of course wasn't entirely correct, but then you go back to that point of Armin's narration abruptly cutting short at the start of this episode, then Erwin saying that he puts the basement over humanity's victory and all that. Like, yeah, whatever it is, someone's dead and it's not gonna be good. Okay, but for real, this is so cool even watching it now, it's so cool, I know what happens, it's still so cool, I want to see more series do this sort of weird fourth wall breaky, tradition breaking teasers thingy. It was so creepy, I loved it. But with that, that is episode 49. A slower one, but oh boy is it a dense one. With how controversial the whole Erwin versus Armin pick is, my Attack Titan tells me I'm already being roasted, but it is what it is. We'll of course talk about the controversy when we actually get there as well. But with that said, enough talk, because next time it is officially Return to Shiganshina time. So I hope to see you back as we continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. And that's the video. Feels like it's been both forever, as well as just the blink of an eye, but we are now past the midpoint of the series, and in a few months from now, the basement reveal will already be upon us. Truly wild. That said, it's still gonna take a while, but I really don't want the series to end, so HBO, maybe Amazon, hurry up and get the rights for a live-action version so I can overanalyze that too. Which, by the way, yes, if anything like that were to be announced, of course I'd make a little spin-off of the series for that. I'm not gonna lie, I'm like really desperate for anything to do with Attack on Titan. Working on this little video, seeing that glitching intro again, oh my god, I need something to think about again. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, I Got Sauce. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.